Thank you, Emily, and thank you all for joining this panel on practical privacy engineering. As Emily mentioned, my name is Amol Deshpande, and I serve as a chief scientist at Wireville, and I'll moderate this discussion. We have a fantastic group of people on the panel here, and I'll introduce them in a minute. Our goal with this panel is to dive deeper into tools, methodologies, and techniques to ensure that your company can integrate privacy into its design processes and workflows. Right? This rapidly growing field is often called privacy engineering, although one of the key questions is often defining that term precisely and making sure that that function is properly supported somewhere within the organization. Our panelists have all worked on implementing privacy practices in their respective organizations now and before, in organizations with different scales and different levels of maturity from privacy perspective. So I'm really looking forward to learning from them with you. So with that, let me introduce our panelists. Our first panelist is Yi Huang, who was formerly a director of engineering at Facebook, or I should probably start getting used to this, at Meta. And he was responsible for a lot of the regulatory responses to privacy engineering at privacy regulations at Facebook. Second, we have Anna Togia, who is a technical product manager at Hinge, focusing on privacy, security, and compliance issues there. And lastly, we have Nishant Bajaria, who heads privacy engineering and assurance at Uber. Nishant has literally written a book on privacy engineering, which is coming out very soon. So welcome all of you, and thank you for joining me here on the panel. Let me start with a kind of a broad question here. There's a lot of noise in privacy engineering, right? How do you define it? What kind of challenges to address? When do you address them? I guess my first question to you would be, how would you frame sort of a core problem that you focus on in your work that you really think is important to highlight and work on? And so let me just go in order here. Yi, would you like to take a first stab?
Yeah, sure. So really happy to be here. Thanks, Amal. So the core problem I can think of is pretty much what you just said, kind of the noise in the privacy space. It's very important for bigger companies at Facebook scale to really laser focus on the most important problem and remove the noise. So at a certain time, there are multiple privacy regulations coming to the company, and then we have to deal with all of them at the same time. So the compliance, each one of them will have different kind of the timeline, deadline. It's kind of really the distraction and noise to the entire organization. So and then we start to ask ourselves. So instead of apply just being compliant, simply being compliant to each one of them as the regulation comes. How can we really respond to the challenges, to the regulations more effectively, reduce the response time, increase the effectiveness, and increase our confidence of our privacy engineering work? So the core fundamental problem is really, what can we do? How can we really, what technology can we put into the system, into our product building, so that we don't have to do everything that we're doing today? That's kind of the core problem, a little bit of long-term focus, but practically it's really, really difficult to do because you have to juggle multiple balls, right? There's the short-term regulatory pressure, there are long-term work you have to do. So that's kind of the bigger challenge to us.
Great. And yeah, I mean, we're definitely going to delve deeper into it as we go through the panel. So let me pose the same question to Anna here.
Sure, thanks, Amal. And I think, a lot of what you and Yi have already touched on and alluded to, and probably a lot of what we're going to talk about today is the first problem for us, especially as a small company and, as someone specifically who probably has the least tech savvy knowledge when it comes to engineering on this panel. For us, it's really a question of how do we define that term privacy engineering as an organization that doesn't necessarily have the resources to structure a privacy engineering team per se. Part of our problem is what does then privacy engineering look like for us? And so some of the things that we've done over the course of just the last year is we've asked ourselves questions of really, are we looking at technical know-how, or is it more that we're looking at process management? Or maybe it's a combination and hybrid approach to both. And if that's the case, then where should privacy engineering sit? Is it a product function? Is it design? Is it IT? Is it security? Or is it some combination of all of those things? So we've really been working diligently to start to define how we can build privacy in rather than sort of bolting it on when it comes to design and to new feature development, which really for us is just kind of an extension to what we're already doing in trying to adopt this this concept of privacy by design. So really we're looking at privacy engineering as sort of the most technical side that you can have of the privacy ecosystem, and really ensuring that, you know, a lot of those privacy considerations are integrated and baked into product design, and really looking at who has onus within those. I may be sounding like it's a problem that we've fully solved, and we haven't. But it makes it a lot easier when we do start to then look at things like collection and storage and management and usage of personal data, which for someone who works for a dating app is a lot. I can attest to that. And really that we're doing that as ethically as possible. You know, we heard yesterday that there are new frameworks coming down the pipeline, and the privacy landscape is moving at a very rapid and aggressive pace. And so it's really understanding, you know, what are our terms and how are we defining privacy engineering, and who really has a stake in the game that's going to help us solve this question and this problem.
Great. Thanks, Anna. And yeah, you're absolutely right. Like there's going to be a lot of companies, organizations who are just getting started, who are probably not big enough to throw a ton of resources at this problem. And it's really important for those companies to even, or it's really hard for them to even take a first step. So that perspective is going to be really valuable for us. Right. Nishant?
Thank you again for having me on this conference. Super happy to be here. And I don't usually start my mornings thinking about the Titanic, but there was a scene in the movie somewhere a third of the way through, and they were looking back and saying, how did this captain not see the iceberg coming? Like it was out there in the open. And there was a line that said that, you know, everything he knew was wrong. He didn't anticipate the changes in the weather. He didn't realize how big the ship was, how much time it would take to turn around. So that analogy, I hope the Titanic analogy is limited when it comes to privacy, because that didn't end particularly well for the people on the ship. But there is a larger point here. The things that have made us very successful as a tech industry may not automatically transfer on the privacy security side. Having siloed teams, bespoke processes, independent tech stacks, allowing complete autonomy to engineers, those are wonderful things. They lead to the creation of great services. They lead to low latency, high throughput, amazing engagement, and we've all been the beneficiaries of that. And society has changed immeasurably in the last 15 years because of how the tech industry operates. On privacy and security and data protection in general, you need to understand end-to-end how the data flows, who collected it, how do you use it, who sent it, where, how was it shared. Those are decisions that are made across the board by multiple automated systems without any clear visibility. We are literally sailing into the night and running towards an iceberg at times and not knowing that the iceberg is there. So the biggest challenge for any of us and all of us on this panel, in this audience, is going to be, how do we use the best of our tech impulses in terms of the things I talked about before, and how do we repurpose our instincts, our data, our processes, and our tooling to ensure that we don't double down on the things that will not work from a privacy security purposes. And the reason I highlight this is because right from the executive on down to the most junior engineer, everybody thinks a certain way. And that attitude shift has to happen up and down, left and right in the organization. You cannot delegate it to a TPM or a tool or an executive. This is going to have to be a full team effort.
Thanks, Nishan. That analogy is definitely very apt, and certainly something we saw, especially early on when GDPR was coming out and talking with companies. Privacy officers clearly saw the problem, but getting the rest of the organization convinced that it was a big problem was a challenge back then. Lot less today, I hope. So I do sort of, there is a bunch of sort of questions I have in my mind about how does one go about solving these problems, and I do want our audience here to come out with something concrete that they can potentially start thinking about implementing. But before I get to specific questions, maybe I'd like to sort of try to see if we can get a key takeaway from all of you about, like, so you had a problem that you identified. What kind of frameworks did you were you able to successfully implement, to use to solve those problems. And maybe after that, then we can maybe go deeper into some specific questions around the challenges. And so let me just go in the same order. Yi, what would be your sort of biggest success in this space?
Yeah, it's a very good question. I think defining the right success metrics is probably the most important thing, right? It will really make the job half done probably. So just a reminder that the kind of problem that we perceive is really the kind of technologies that we put into place, so that we don't have to do all the kind of the dirty work, the firefighting work that we're doing today, right? So I really second what Anna and Nishant said. So a lot of them is organizational problems. A lot of them is technology problems. So sometimes we have the good intention to solve the hard technical problems, the privacy problems, but we just don't have the technology ready in place to do that. One example is really to, for example, so Facebook is a large international company dealing with the customers from all countries. How do we know where the data flows, right? How do we know where the data is processed? Which country processes the data? We have to satisfy with the different country laws. So this is kind of important for us to deal with, but the technology really doesn't exist today, and we have to really put into place. And so that's kind of the problem that I talked about before. Kind of the framework that we use. Well, there are kind of a lot of them. There are organizational level frameworks. There's kind of technological levels of frameworks. But one of them I can think of pretty important for us. It's kind of straightforward, but it's very important for us to do. It's very difficult to exercise, which is we really need to separate the regulatory response task force from the other task force that focuses on technologies. Right, so this is not the case in many companies, right? As far as I know, many companies have only one task force focusing on privacy, right? But if you have only one task force focusing on privacy, then we'll see that there's only one thing that the task force can do, right? But here, what we're really trying to do is to really, being able to survive on the one side, focus on the regulatory responses with the goals set for the next 6 months, the next 3 months. But on the other hand, which is more important, is really focus on the fundamentals, building the right technologies and then making the right changes to the organizations so that we can be in a better place in the future, no matter what the regulations come to us. And these two task forces have completely different success metrics, have completely different goals, have completely different kind of talent profiles. So really separating them and running them in parallel help to balance the priorities between them. So we actually try to put them together at one time. And what we find out is that eventually one of the task forces will have to starve, right? Because you can only optimize for one thing if you have only one. So that's kind of one framework that we're doing, kind of separating them and setting up completely different metrics, different goals for them, and then just try to not share the same stuffing as much as possible, so that they can run in parallel. So that's kind of one of the probably most important. But of course, there are other things that deep down that we have to set up in order to make the right goals.
All right, that's really interesting. So just to delve slightly deeper into that, so what, can you give examples of what different goals you set for these two task force, or different metrics you set for them?
Yeah, so let's say if you have a task force focuses on, let's say, GDPR, which is coming in the next 6 months, and then what you would do is to figure out where your system is today, your product is today, and where and how much you understand today, and then figure out the gap. And then you split the gap into multiple tasks. Let's say 1,000 tasks to complete, right, within the next 6 months. And then you set up goals, how many tasks to finish within each month, each week, and that's going to be your dashboard. And then you know that as long as you finish this 1,000 tasks, probably you're fine, but you may not be kind of in the super awesome state. You won't be satisfied with where you are, but your goal is really to survive, right, in the next 6 months. But on the other hand, you know that within 6 months, you probably won't be able to build the technologies that you need in order to handle this type of problems. And then you think about what the new technology to build, right? And then you think of, oh, you have about 100 different components in your systems, and you probably want to find the most important component in the system to handle first, and you set up your milestones. You probably needed to have set up the kind of metrics similar to when you launch a new product. When you launch a new infrastructure, you have a testing phase, you have prototyping, testing, and then adoption, kind of different phases. That's probably going to take 1 year or even more to launch a certain infrastructures and then expand from there. So the metrics will be different from the other way. But the thing is that they have different goals. So the first one only targets one regulation, one compliance. The other one targets one class of regulations, right? And then the success metrics would be how well we handle the next coming regulations, which we don't know, which is similar, right? So
that's really useful. You're absolutely right. And most companies are probably not making that distinction, and that distinction between short-term immediate response versus a longer-term vision strategic focus is a really important one. Great.
Yeah, to be fair, I believe that most companies would want to really focus on both, especially the longer term. But it's really hard to do in practice, especially you have external pressure that have a timeline that really not off your control, most of cases. Yeah.
Okay. So I'm sure we'll come back to that one. But let me pose that same question to Anna about what she found most sort of useful to do first to get started.
Yeah, I'm actually really glad that you touched a lot on the technology. And I'll preface with, we didn't plan this, but I think something that really harmoniously goes with that, and a little bit less of a framework, but is just kind of thinking about who do you hire, right, into these roles when you're thinking about the privacy engineering space. And I'll sort of stick to our problem of really being a small fish in a big pond in this privacy ecosystem. For us, it's really been a concern of, who do we get and who are the right people to solve some of these major privacy concerns, right? When we're not thinking about building out an entire team, but we are leveraging some of the resources that we already have or hiring kind of into more broad engineering roles. And so I actually have the pleasure of working really closely with, for example, a lot of our backend and data engineering teams. And while we have tried to adopt a little bit of the framework that you was alluding to earlier and sort of specifying different work streams, if you will, the approach that we take is really understanding that while I know that they have their core skills and they're hired for things like experience in our API architecture and how to build our, cloud native services and experience in data mapping, those are all really important to what you're going to be doing sort of day in and day out in this role. But then I'm also gauging for which of those also have an interest in privacy specifically. And so I think a big part of it is ensuring that we staff this team, if you will, working on privacy initiatives with people who actually care, who have a little bit of a vested interest, maybe not a lot of experience in that space, but someone who can pick it up, right? That has sort of the technical know-how, and then really has also an understanding that the impact that privacy is going to have or supposed to have in all of our dedicated spaces. And I think if you do that, and if you have your baseline technical bar to start, you're going to have people who develop the right technical skills pretty well. So I think it's a matter of, if you're asking sort of where our starting point is, I think you have to look at the health and the structure of your engineering team. And Nishant said this well earlier, you also have to sort of look at the division between your disciplines. It's really hard when you have silos. So really focusing on this concept of champions and advocates, and that probably has a trickle down effect to, and I'll touch quickly on just like the education that we give and provide and expect from folks that are going to be working in or closely to the privacy space. And so we've considered in the new year adding things to our department specific onboardings, things like regular privacy and security trainings and refreshers, because I think like we've all talked about and know and is keeping us up at night. There are a lot of regulations and feels like popping up every single day. And so really kind of making sure that at a minimum, these teams and these folks that we've deemed the subject matter experts in privacy really have that combination of technical know-how as well as the regulatory knowledge to implement the right safeguards and processes into our various products and our features.
Great, thanks, Anna. That's definitely in general the human resources around this and education is definitely going to be a real key. Is a real key to making this work in practice. Was there something that you specifically? I don't know if this may not be an easy question to answer, but was there something specifically that helped you build out the right team, or was it more? I don't know if there are a lot of people who have background in both the tech side and the privacy side. So you probably have to find some way to either teach the tech people the privacy stuff or the privacy people the tech stuff. Was there anything that worked for you or?
Yeah, I think it can go either way, right? Well, speaking as someone who is a layman when it comes to the engineering space, I err on the side of get folks who are passionate about privacy. I don't think that there are necessarily people in these roles that need to know down to the nitty gritty, every part of a regulation or a law. And I think that that's somewhere where a role like mine comes into play, is making sure that we are creating and cultivating the right awareness and culture around privacy and compliance and what that sort of means for each work stream and role specifically. But I think if you have folks with the technical know-how to work on an app, on the web, you have front end, back end engineers that really kind of know their skills. And then there's also a benefit of them wanting to gain more awareness and more understanding and more experience in the privacy space. Those are the people that you want to go for, because those are the people that are also, you can also champion to educate the rest of the team, right? We've got QA managers as well as backend managers who are really passionate about the privacy space. And that then disseminates out to the rest of their team and their organization. And then again, you start to really cultivate this privacy by design sort of ecosystem that we're all looking to get to, that North Star, if you will.
And I'm sure we'll come back to the people and education questions. But let me pose that earlier question to Nishant about what kind of frameworks did you find most successful?
Yeah, so a couple of responses. I love everything that Yi and Anna said. So, the best time to fix the roof is when the sun is shining. That's what President Kennedy said back in the day. The best time to have privacy and security controls is when the data footprint is small. What often happens out of muscle memory is that we want to find the best of all worlds. We want to avoid disrupting the flow of data from the edge API layer. We want to make sure the microservices get the data they need. We want to make sure that the machine learners, the data scientists have all the access they need at the warehouse level. And then somewhere down the line, we get around to deleting data. The problem at that point is the data size has grown. APIs have started spitting their data outside to third-party vendors. Additionally, some other data has been created based on the data that was initially collected. So we're basically trying to get the mileage of a Tesla with the chassis of a Toyota at that point, and it simply doesn't work. This is why tools time out, engineers don't notice an impact, and then people give up and say, oh, this is impossible to achieve, and then people become used to that risk. So my advice from a framework perspective would be try and identify what you have at a very early stage. You will find it much easier simply because not as many customers exist for that data at that point because people don't know that the data exists. When you tag and qualify that data early on, you can then harness actual privacy controls. Like this is data that is very, very location or IP specific, and the customer has now moved. Maybe we don't need that data anymore. So you delete it or sequester it somehow. So you can make those sorts of deterministic outcomes possible if you make that intervention very early in the process. It might seem like a culture shift, but I feel like the tooling and the engineering teams that make this outcome happen will find it much easier to scale that point forward. So that's something that's very important. When it comes to staffing, I do want to sort of really hit upon the point Anna made, which is, so when I first got my first privacy role, it was not called privacy engineering. In fact, that discipline didn't exist. I was at WebMD back in the day, and I had one area of specialization, which is I used to process a bunch of backend data. So I understood how the backend infrastructure worked. So when something came up saying, hey, we need to get this taken care of from a privacy perspective, I was a de facto privacy engineer in town, if you will. From that point forward, I built an expertise in the identity space, and that's how I got into privacy. The lesson behind this is you will find that there are a lot more privacy engineers today than there were 10 years ago, but it's still imbalanced. We hear a lot about supply chain issues these days. The supply chain problem that people need to talk about is the privacy engineering problem, and the relatively small supply of privacy engineers available to fix it right now. So that's kind of why I wrote the book you talked about earlier, which is I would look to your talent in-house first and train them with the tricks of privacy engineering. They probably understand the backend, they understand the flow of data, they understand the Kafka pipeline, they understand all the data annotations, they understand the flow of schema-less or non-schema data, if you will. So some of that knowledge is in-house. So what I think I would recommend folks to do is train your engineers in-house to understand how you build data lineage. How do you identify what data gets shared? What restrictions are enough? Do you throttle an API or do you obfuscate the data? Do you aggregate the data? How do you measure the privacy protection that you put into the system? These are all quantifiable outcomes, and you can then make a decision in a framework that is a lot more defensible should an auditor take a look at your data, right? So it's critical to start with the internal teams, because even if you end up buying third-party tools, even if you hire consultants on the outside, it's important that your engineers are able to imbibe those external interventions into their system, and they cannot do that unless they have the end-to-end coverage or visibility. So I would strongly recommend training internal engineers, because even if your internal engineers don't become privacy engineers, you want to make sure that they make reasonable, defensible, trust-driven decisions, because at the end of the day, the data you collect could be somebody's life and death. It could be somebody's preferences, it could be somebody's location data, right? It could be data that determines how well somebody is able to operate in their life. So it is extremely critical that you have the synergy between third-party tools, outside vendors, regulators, and internal engineers, because that's where the culture shift truly happens.
Fully agree on that, on the last point that you made. I think as at Wireville also, when we work with our customers, that getting that internal teams involved, especially IT teams involved, is crucial to do anything beyond the most basic compliance activities. So both great points. And I have a bunch of follow-up questions, but we also have some great questions coming from the audience here. So let me just go through a few of them, and they also align with some of the things I wanted to ask you. So the first question here is, what build to release lifecycle processes do you use to align privacy engineering reviews and a typical organizational technology release cycle? I don't know, Yi and
I can. Yeah, this is I can say a little bit words. So on my side, this is a great question. So let me just rephrase the question a little bit. I think this question is about the release cycle, but I think let me just expand a little bit to talk about how a privacy review process get integrated into engineering development process or product process, right? So so certainly getting integrated into the release process, it's necessary but not sufficient. So what we were doing is we have multiple integration points to integrate this privacy into this product development process, the whole product development process. A release is kind of the last point. It doesn't really cover everything. It covers some of the most important things that can be automated. It's really kind of small things, but it kind of provides a verification purpose. But it's the heavy lifting really happens in the beginning, because we have found out that the earlier you get involved into the privacy discussions, the better. You can potentially save a huge amount of time. So we actually started from the bottom and then lifting up and to the beginning. So the first major discussion, kind of conversation about privacy and the product is really in the product design phase before engineering actually put any code. Right, we discuss how a specific product is being built, what the data the product is using, and what the privacy implications it has. And through this process, we discover a bunch of trade-offs, and we make just the trade-offs, and we document them, right, based on the principled approach. So that's the first time we get involved in the privacy discussion, and then the implementation stage. So once we know what exactly the behavior the product should have, and we implement them, and this stage focuses really not on what the data should be used, how to handle this data, right? Because this decision has already been made in the beginning. So in the second stage, implementation stage, what we're focusing on is whether we are doing what we say we are doing. Right, so we don't want to leave any big blank over there, right? So that's a whole bunch of different approaches, right? We put this assertion, verification points, checking points in place. We really check that we're doing what we say we're doing, and then after this, it's finished. And before the release process, we also have the privacy engineering review process. That's to look at everything we have done to making sure that there's no loose end. Right, and this review process probably will take a few rounds, and usually it's very painful if you haven't done the first 2 rounds well enough, and we may be able to identify a bunch of gaps, and then we have to go back and fix the product, fix the implementation. That would take a longer time. But if you have done the good due diligence in the first 2 steps, the privacy review will become much easier. And after privacy review is done, we're ready to ship. And that's where the release cycle getting integrated. And we put the kind of random, not really random, kind of the smaller checkpoints, which is the most critical ones, but smaller, easier to check into the release cycle to make sure everything works. But this is only kind of before the product getting shipped out of the door. But once the product gets shipped off the door, we also need to make sure that the product is not getting modified, changed, accidentally in a way that not intended, right? We also have the auditing in place, the checks, ongoing checks to make sure that the product continue to behave the way that we want it to behave.
Great point, C. I was curious sort of to ask a follow-on question on that. Was there any specific sort of standard or framework that you tried to follow here? Because integrating privacy sort of reviews throughout the process, it's a complex process, right? I was part of an ISO group trying to develop a consumer privacy standard, and there are so many steps in it. There's design, build, review, then maintenance, retention, like all of these things. There's a lot of things to think about there. So was there something that you found useful that our audience can refer to in terms of what the key points were to integrate these steps are?
That's a good question. So yeah, I know that there were a lot of standards, but as far as I know, none of the standards is a silver bullet to us, right? So it's kind of we kind of follow multiple standards, and then plus our own internal practices, and to make a superset of the standards that we think the most works for us the most. And we keep changing that as well, improving that as well. So there's really not a single one that really works, but probably there's one for different products, but it's kind of keeps changing depending on the product we ship.
Anna, Nishant, would you like to add anything to answer in?
Anna, you want to go first? I'm happy to defer to you first. Okay, I can jump in. So when it comes to privacy reviews, traditionally there's been the DPI API process that is run by the legal team, and the problem with that is that it puts the legal team in an impossible situation. They either have the task of letting something go that is not great or seen as the blocker, and that creates this unnecessary friction where the attorneys are seen as the bad folks who are the blockers, and the engineers are seen as the cavalier rule breakers. It's not optimized to make anybody successful. Plus, you cannot ever staff the team with enough attorneys to make sure that all the privacy reviews are done in depth. So I have a model that is very similar to what you mentioned before. So I hire a team of privacy consultants or privacy architects who report into me. I used to have that role at Uber before I took over the team as a whole. What we essentially do is we intervene at the inception stage. So when the engineering doc is a product requirement doc. So before the ERD becomes before the PRD becomes an ERD, somebody is just kind of like looking at the whiteboard. We intervene at that step. We ask questions like, do you need to collect this data? Could you not use this other data store that exists already? Do you want to tokenize this data? Do you want to build out access control? How is the key management system structured? There are a number of engineering centric questions. In fact, you could automate a lot of these checks. Like you don't need to have a human to human conversation. The goal here is to make sure that the eng teams that are building these products find out early on what risk they're taking on. You can quantify that risk. You can quantify the alleged benefit it'll bring, and then you can also quantify the outcome of that were it to go live. And you can have those conversations very early on at an engineer to engineer level. Concurrently, you can also build some muscle memory about what trends have you noticed, like which teams tend to take on more data, which teams tend to partner with third-party vendors. Like that sort of institutional muscle memory does not come in a day. It definitely does not come when attorneys have to go through 50 different privacy reviews, at the end of the day to get something out tomorrow. So having that knowledge developed within the engineering community in the company, privacy engineers on one side and the engineers building the features on the other side, that is extremely helpful. That will enable you to build the tooling that will help address some of these issues. So if you find out that there are a ton of these teams collecting a lot of data, but they only need that for a couple of days, you can write a deletion service that will query some of their databases on the third or the fourth day and make sure that nobody's querying that data and delete it right off the bat without the team feeling the burn at all, without that data making it to the warehouse, to Kafka, to third party, etc. You can fix the problem right off the bat. So you are investing in automation, but in a very targeted fashion. And then concurrently, you can furnish some of that information to the attorneys who do the PIAs. They will then update privacy policies. They will update their training mechanisms. You will then be able to advise. So typically what happens is you start with the first principles and then you struggle to come up with implementation details. What I'm saying is let's flip the pyramid a little bit. Let's get the implementation details right and use those learnings to inform the privacy principles and their evangelism across the company. So this is a way to unblock the privacy review process by not having it slow down in the tail end of the process. That's number one. It avoids bad blood between the eng community and the product community on the one side and the attorneys on the other. And you will progressively build your automation on an ongoing basis. Remember, your tools are not consistent across the board. Like whether you look at Meta, whether you look at any other big company, every team does things a bit differently. If your data is fluid, there is no reason why the privacy policy and privacy review has to be static. Your privacy review checkup has to be dynamic like the data itself. So you want to make sure that you have a more consultative engineering advisory approach at the front end of the process so that the more legal DPIA process at the tail end does not have to carry the burden.
Great point. Sorry, go ahead, Anna.
No, I was going to say, I want to carry what Nishant just said into another question, because I think he's doing a really great job sort of sprinkling his answers into some of the other questions that were in the chat. And I think, two things to touch on is really the communication between teams that almost speak different languages, I think is one of the biggest barriers and one of the biggest hurdles. And I saw someone ask in the chat, how do you sort of justify spend and not make privacy expensive? And a lot of the challenges that we sometimes face in this space is engineers and our general counsels and our lawyers don't necessarily always speak the same language. And so really being able to disseminate that information between teams is a huge I think time and level of effort saver. But I think on top of that, one other thing that Nishant alluded to earlier too is figuring out trends over time really justifies the value and the sake of privacy. I think being able to even look at some sort of like month over month sentiment analysis on privacy is going to go a really long way. Being able to catalog things like frequency and severity of privacy incidents is a really great place to start, sort of differentiate between how you quantify some of those privacy incidents and whether they're plausible or identifiable, and really then look at the types of privacy failures that your system currently has and how much you're able to or how much you have fixed over time. And that is really sort of the baseline metrics that you can then take to decision makers and to top leaders at your organization. And then also I think just combine privacy doesn't have to just be the things that we have to comply with. I think that there is also a degree to which we can empower and give business counterparts the tools to be able to gather data and make strategic decisions, right? So privacy sort of then trickles down into other business decision making that we're doing, where it isn't just, okay, these laws and these regulations are coming out and we now have to band-aid fix them, right? Like if we are intentionally treating and using data in the right way and know how we are collecting it and capturing it and the way that it kind of flows throughout its life cycle is really a benefit to anyone using internal tools or looking and manipulating data. So I think that you can often justify privacy as more than just what it is at face value, and really kind of leverage it in other ways in an organization if you are just a little bit creative.
Oh, can I make a point real quick? Something Anna said.
Yeah,
which
please
jumped
do.
out at me.
Yeah.
So I know this perception that privacy is expensive tends to come up a lot. And, let's face it, it is expensive, but like what's more expensive? 4% of your revenue, your reputation being bad. So that's something else to consider. But I also want to get away from us arguing from a defensive, punitive position where if you don't do this, X bad things will happen. Think of it this way. If you have a lot of data in your warehouse, more data than you need, you are probably encrypting it or somehow protecting it, right? You are protecting data that you probably shouldn't have at that point. It's not adding value to the business, but you are paying to protect it. So it's a security risk. It's a business risk. It's an unnecessary expenditure, right? So having some of the privacy controls built early on in the process may shrink your data footprint and by definition shrink your risk. It's like not having a ton of money under your mattress and you also live in a bad neighborhood, right? So having some of that in a bank means that even if somebody breaks into your house, the risk of you losing that money goes down. So it's fundamentally a risk management issue, not a privacy issue. But the other thing I would mention is people often fail to appreciate the cost of bad data, the cost of querying data that is not good data to begin with. You are probably funneling bad information to your machine learners, your business models. You are then funneling that bad information to your board of directors. You might use that information then to do mergers and acquisitions, divestitures, what have you. What is the cost of carrying that bad data and converting that data into decisions, right? So when you reduce your data footprint, when you understand what you have, you are essentially improving the data quality of your business across the board as well. So my advice to people would be don't just position it as a privacy expense, because when you do that, you are setting yourself up to be the scold in the company, and nobody likes the scold after a certain point in time. But more importantly, you are creating a culture of compliance only where people are going to be like, okay, I'll check this box and then we're done. You want to make sure that this is seen as a sustained strategic partnership between you and the data science team, you and the marketing team, you and the security team, you and the platform team. Build those relationships, educate people early on in the process. Honestly, if you were to go back and look at my career, more than any technical tool I built, more than any program I built, more than any meeting I called, it is having that understanding flow to the leadership in the business. That was the biggest win. Every time I didn't do that on time, it came back to bite me. So I cannot say this enough. Don't make it just about privacy.
That's a great point, Nishant. And I think a lot of people are struggling to convince the leadership that there is more value here and is not just a cost center, that there's really important reasons why we should do this, even if regulators are not at the door. Yeah, I mean, we could continue this discussion for a long time, but I do want to make sure I go through the questions. So let me hold some of the questions I have and maybe go through the rest of the questions we have here. So the one question here is, are there automated tools to identify whether a system or application or database patterns of use are consistent in terms of a privacy policy and or automatically apply the right rule? And I guess this sort of gets to a bigger question of where do you think is the tool ecosystem right now for privacy engineering, right? Sort of both of you, both Yi and Nishant, talked about incorporating privacy at various different points. And this is something that we are thinking about all the time as well, right? We want to build tools that make it easy for companies to do that. But as far as I can tell, this ends up being a fairly, so at this point, it is a fairly custom and internal process to put this steps in the process or put these tools in the process. Right? So
yeah, that's right. Yeah, that's right. So the way how I think about the privacy tooling, I put privacy tools into 4 different buckets. And the first one is introspection. Second one is detection. The third one is enforcement. The last one is verification. So there are tools that do different kinds of jobs. We are in different buckets. So as you see that introspection is tools will help you to understand your systems better. You probably don't understand your systems when you build it, or the kind of knowledge that your developers have when building your systems or products are really in their own mind, not in the code or kind of in the different level of abstractions. So you wanted to really understand how your system works, how your data flows. That's the introspection. Detection is to detect when the violation happens, or when you may potentially make privacy mistakes or risks. And enforcement is to block such cases from happening in the first place, rather than just detecting it. Detecting it's post-mortem, right? So, and the last is verification, which is it's to prove that you are following, you are being compliant, basically, right? You're not violating any privacy policy, generating the PI, DPIA, or ROPA documents that would just prove that you're fine. So all those tools, my experience is that right today, or certainly we don't have tools that satisfy also 4 buckets. That this is my understanding, but I'd love to hear. I may be missing important parts, but across those 4 different buckets, I think the most relatively more mature ones is the introspection and the detection, because those don't really require you to understand the systems and the policy. They only require you to understand the system and the products, but don't really require you to understand the policies. But the policies are really difficult to understand, as we mentioned before. There's a language issue, communication issue between different functions. So this is a little bit hard. But the tools in the second and the third buckets are really lacking today, But even though the tools in the first 2 buckets relatively more mature, but still kind of in the beginning, right? So I think one of the reasons why it's really hard for us to respond to privacy regulations. It's because we really don't understand how data really flows through the systems. We may know how data flows in certain cases, but it's really hard to come up with high confidence answers. Yeah, here are the ways that the data flows. So most of the tools in the first 2 buckets have high false positives, also have high false negatives at the same time. So this is a bigger problem. We want the tools to have low false positives and low false negatives, but relatively they're more motive, but still a long way to go. But the last 2 buckets are still really lacking today.
Thanks, C. Nishant, Anna, do you want to add anything?
Yeah, I'll say the other vector of tool that's really missing, tooling is missing, is verification. Like, you have to make sure that you have some way to ensure that you discover the data that you have, you've deleted the data, DSARs were filled correctly, things like that. There's a number of different forcing functions that exist to have privacy tooling, but how do you know that you have done everything you could? Like, I'm sure there's an engineer somewhere out there right now assuring their manager or their attorney that we have deleted everything or we have completed everything and there is no known risk. And then the attorney is going to wake up tomorrow morning, realize that that wasn't true, not because the engineer was dissembling, but they didn't know because somebody else was doing something. So how do you span the organization, which is kind of very similar to the point you just made, but how do you ascertain, how do you measure confidence of success, and how do you allow for potential risks and failures? That's where the tooling is really missing. And I'm not exactly sure it can be fixed either just internally or just externally. Like, you need to make sure that there is some combination of efforts consistently. And this is where building that muscle, continuously working cross-functionally, building out lineage, looking at who queries what data store, how frequently will help. I don't know if that tooling is ready for prime time just yet. I don't think it's ready for a matinee either, but I feel like starting someplace is going to be very critical. So for those of you starting your programs now, make sure that you build tooling to verify and validate as much as you build tooling to actually initiate.
And that's a great point, Nishant. And just sort of this kind of follows into the next question that we have here is, what does an MVP, like a minimal viable prototype privacy engineering function looks like for a company? And maybe Anna has the great, like, most recent expertise in something like this. Anna, would you like to answer that one?
Yeah, can you guys hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you now. You dropped off for a
perfect.
minute, but now you're
Yeah, no, I was booted out of the chat, and it wasn't because I didn't want to answer the last question, I promise. No, you're right. I think this is a really big question that we are looking at, especially at our size. And I think the important thing to think about, especially anyone else that's listening to this session that's maybe on a small team or sort of a party of one, is that it doesn't make privacy any less vital. Users or other companies, or whether you're in the B2B or B2C space, have probably entrusted you and us with enormous amounts of data. So for us, and for looking at MVP, it's really kind of a matter of ubiquity. This needs to be a pervasive concern, and we need to be asking ourselves, how do we organizationally affect that? Is it a level of subject matter expertise, like I talked a little bit about earlier? Is it empowering champions across the entire organization? Or are you basically creating shared responsibilities across disciplines and domains, so that you're not just bolting privacy onto feature development? So I think that's really the first question to answer. And that's sort of where we're at right now, is how do we find these resources that have that passion, that excitement to be working on some of our privacy initiatives? And the other thing, and one thing that I just discussed with some of my engineers the other day, is this question of, do we just burn down the old system now while we can, especially while we're still small, and maybe start fresh and pipe data into a new system that's able to expose data in a way that honors privacy? We haven't quite answered that piece quite yet, but maybe come back to me in 6 months or a year from now, and I'll tell you that starting from scratch was the right approach.
We'll look forward to having you back here in 6 months or a year to answer that question. We have a recording, so we'll hold you to that.
That's right.
I'm sure you and Nishant have things to add to that, but let me, in the interest of time, maybe let me just get to the last question and see what all three of you have to say about that, which is on the ethical and reputational privacy considerations, and especially ethical considerations, which have just been growing in the last couple of years, as much as privacy was growing 5 years ago. So do you see that also becoming a part of sort of privacy engineering calculus, or where do you see that playing in? Right. So maybe Yi or Nishant or Anna?
Okay, I'll start. So this is a great question again. I think the ethical use of data is extremely important. My experience is that the discussion mostly happens in the beginning of designing a product. So such as what data you are collecting, how you are using this data right now. When you build the models, what features you are using, right? Facial expression, facial recognition, for example. So are you supposed to use a facial recognition in a specific product? Or the value of facial recognition, the pros and the cons. The value is the brings to the society versus the harms that it potentially causes. Those kind of all the trade-off questions are hard to be in the implementation stage, mostly in the design stage. And then we actually had a lot of discussions about those trade-offs. And we made a principles decisions. So we know that Facebook has already deprecated the face recognition feature, because that's after the discussion. The harm is way more than the benefits it brings. So we only limited this to specific cases. But of course, the facial recognition is not the only cases where ethical AI plays. There are also cases where it's okay to collect a certain data, but it may not be ethical in those, right? For example, it's not ethical probably to deliver ads to certain people based on some racial or personal traits, right? So those discussions really happened in the beginning of the product design. If the decision is no, certain data shouldn't be used, well, there are actually multiple safeguards to put it in place to make sure that this data is filtered out. So that's kind of the things that as I said, the kind of discussions usually happens in the beginning, not really in the release cycle, in the development processes.
Thanks, Nishant or Anna?
Yeah, happy to talk a little about this. So, when I finished my undergrad degree, my dad took me to New York for my my celebration, and I stood by the ticker in Times Square that has all the blue chip tech stocks names up there. And I promised myself that one day, someday I would work for one of these companies, because growing in Missouri, where I went to college, those companies typically didn't hire. Remote work was not a big thing those days. And now that I'm in the tech industry, it's interesting because usually when a company or when an industry is as successful as tech has been, you tend to have a great reputation. People look at you with admiration. And yet somehow big tech does not command that admiration right now. We're not quite as unpopular as big tobacco, but if Steve Bannon and Bernie Sanders both think we're bad, something is going wrong. And I feel like that reputational aspect is very important. Like, we are seen as an industry that rewards wealth, not work. And we are seen as disruptors in a way that doesn't benefit anybody except for the creators of that disruption. So the reputational aspect is very important here. The challenge is, how do we make sure that we build in a way that not only improves our reputation, but delivers actual benefits and transparency to the customers like my dad, who are not very tech savvy, customers like my friends who are extremely tech savvy. So how do we make sure that we are seen as not an exclusive club that essentially does the same thing no matter what company we work for, but as part of a larger society ecosystem? So if we bring that sensibility to how we build tools, if we communicate that to our users with evidence, that is pretty important. So all the tooling, all the processes we've talked about during this call should go towards building that relationship and not losing sight of that trust at the end of it.
Great point. Anna, would you have anything more to add to that? I'm sure there is a big concern at Hinge, given the kind of data that you have.
Yeah, not so much to that. I think just sort of as my wrap up thought here is that, if you had me sitting in this session about a year ago, I'd probably still be asking myself if there is a thing such as a privacy engineer. And if you're still sitting in that space, then, truthfully, the answer might be no, or at least not yet for you. And what I mean by that is, I think privacy engineering takes a lot of time. We talked about this earlier. It can be really hard to convince execs to invest in. I know Nishant has a little bit of a different flavor there and thought process. But I think, it's difficult because when you're doing it right, you don't necessarily see anything. That's sort of the challenge and the benefit to it. And so if you don't have sort of the luxury of building this team or implementing some of what we've talked about already, then I think you need to see what you have available within the engineering function already. And so I think I'm just going to echo my statement from earlier, where really hire for the technical skills, yes, but my biggest advice is to also make sure that there's this vested interest in the space, and build up from there, whether you are starting from scratch, starting from new, trying to reinvent the wheel on a team.
That's a fantastic way to wrap up this session. Thank you all very much. We're right at 1 o'clock here. So it's great to have all of you here. Thank you very much for your insights, and maybe I'll hand it off to Emily to close here.
Wonderful. Yes, thank you, Amal. That was phenomenal. That wraps our session. Thank you again to our fabulous panelists and the audience for joining us. I really loved this conversation. Again, I want to make sure everyone knows about our closing session later today at 5 p.m. Eastern. Wirewheel CEO Justin Antonopoulos will be hosting a panel on privacy predictions for 2022. The discussion will include privacy experts Jocelyn Aqua from PwC, Andy Dale from Alice, Stacey Gray from the Future of Privacy Forum, and some other surprise guests. So it should be phenomenal. You will not want to miss it. And again, that is at 5 p.m. Eastern today. Next on the agenda is redefining the marketer's relationship with data in the privacy age. And that is starting immediately after this, just after 1 p.m. Eastern. And you can join from your attendee portal page. We'll see you there.